Welcome, everyone, to the Label Paranormal Podcast, the podcast where we explore the unexplained, the mysterious, the downright spooky. We're your hosts, Mark
Hey, guys.
and Tom. And each episode will bring you a new topic of ghosts, aliens, cryptids, and other phenomenon that defy conventional logic. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, you'll find something to intrigue you on the show. So sit back, relax, eat some food, crack a cold one, and get ready to enter the world of all things labeled paranormal. And today we have a special episode. We are talking about Atlantis.
Right.
A little bit into what the myth and how it came about, and then the modern, interpretations of it, and whether or not this was actually a legitimate, civilization, really. It's more than a city, as we were looking through this, and especially me, it's good to get caught up on this because I haven't really, I haven't delved into the Atlantis or anything, the mythology of ancient, Mediterranean, really, in a while. And so it was great to, almost like if you relearn a topic that you learned in high school, almost, you know what I mean? You're learning about it again. So things are a lot newer and, you have an older brain to try to dissect it. But there was a lot of things that, that I know when I was, reading about it and learning about it before that are new now that weren't, published back then. And I just think it's fascinating how, it's ever changing and we continuously disprove ourselves as a whole society, which, I guess is a good thing ultimately.
Yeah.
But I guess it also shows how much we really don't know about our life and the things around us.
Yeah.
So Atlantis, for anybody who may not know about it, this was an ancient civilization that was talked about, I guess, introduced really to mainstream literature back in the day by Plato. And he used it as a metaphor in one of his writings as a society that got too big and got too greedy and got too corrupt and then failed. And they fell out of favor, quote unquote, with the gods and were destroyed in a single day and night. It was an island nation. And the name Atlantis is really our interpretation of it because it's simply translated as the Isle of Atlas, who was
Isle
a god
of Atlas.
that was revered in ancient times. So I think it's fascinating where we don't even have a real name for this place, but we all sort of know it under a different guise. And which I think adds to the mystique and the mystery or the myth of this place is, it was before our earliest, best and brightest minds. And I'm not taking anything away from anybody before that, but when we start to get into text, we started to get into ideology and philosophy, really. You have Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and those, that come to mind first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, these guys predated all of them. These guys had, quote unquote, advanced technology, however you want to define that, but it would be technology that's more advanced than what we have right now, if this is true. And I'm talking, we'll get into more of it, but like lasers and advanced cutting tools and free power from crystals and things like that. So, for them to have revered them and we revere Plato and so forth for their writings and contributions to modern society, it just leads you to think like, well, could he have made it all up? Or did he use a real example and kind of shoehorn his principles into what happened there?
Yeah.
And, to kick this off, you do have that split of, is it myth and he just made up a place really to sell books? Or did he use their concepts and warn his people? Because ultimately who he was trying to warn, they kind of fell victim to what he was trying to teach against. The empires got too big. They started to be more materialistic instead of spiritual. And then they let themselves vulnerable to attack from inside, which sounds very familiar, as we'll get into what Atlantis is, and then crumbled. The only thing that's missing is it didn't fall into the ocean after a cataclysmic event, but they weren't an island. And Atlantis was made up, I believe, of 3 islands. And, it's very plausible that where this is supposedly located could happen. And there's some evidence that we'll get into that shows maybe this did happen. And their stories were told from people who essentially evacuated that.
Right.
So, Mark, I know you have a lot of facts and interest in this, and I love this story, so I don't want to bogart all of it at the time, but this is so fascinating. And reading about it again, I just feel like I feel like a 10-year-old who's telling their parents something again. You know what I mean?
It's really fascinating stuff, and this is really one of my favorite topics because for anybody who's done a cursory overview of Atlantis, they know that the mainstream idea is, like you said, Plato used Atlantis as a metaphor for a greater civilization that collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. And he was trying to write about that. Even Aristotle, his student Aristotle, dismissed it as just a metaphor because really Plato was writing it in that context because he was using it to criticize Athenian democracy and like the structure of it, and to be careful of how things are going. But the fact of the matter is that he did actually write physical descriptions of this place, and I just want to do a quick reading here of his exact text. Hold on, you know what? We'll just do it like that. All right. So I'm just going to read it directly from Plato. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance. But that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Now, that's important here. Yeah. Now, in this island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over the parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. This vast power, gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours, and the whole of the region within the straits. And then, Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune all of your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea, for which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this is caused by the subsidence of the island. Now, that is pretty heavy text. It's obviously, the grammar is not what we're really familiar with, but the key points here that I find is, hold on, let me pull this up, is that it does actually seem to describe specific geographic features. Yeah, it actually describes very specific geographic features, and most notably that the island sort of acts as a harbor, and beyond it is an even greater sea with a boundless continent. And at the end there, when the island sunk, it created a muddy shoal which was impenetrable. So here is the tectonic plate map of the planet. And so right out from it's, I think the Strait of Heracles is the Strait of Gibraltar. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's what it is. Read that. Yeah. So once you go out there, if you notice, right here in this tricorner section between the North American, Eurasian, and African plate, all of the tectonic plates meet right there. So it's interesting to note that right there, it creates this sort of this scenario where it pushes up these ridges,
Yeah.
which ultimately form the Azores Islands. Now, the Azores has been long speculated to be to be the island of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a huge part of all of this is that Atlantis, it's speculated to, and I think Plato clarified that Atlantis sunk about 10,000 years prior to even him. So about 12,000 or 13,000 years ago for us. Now, there isn't really evidence that, these plates sort of, collapsed and sunk the Azores. But I mean, I think it is possible. It is technically possible that we may not have a real, true understanding of the geography of this planet. Because if we go further into this, here, this is basically a highlighted look at what this mid-Atlantic ridge is, where the Azores are. And right in the middle there, there's actually what's suspected to be a microtectonic plate. And I feel like if that's true, that microtectonic plate might have been the thing that really sunk. And if these tectonic plates did sink, it could have created muddy shoals in the Atlantic. But what it really could mean, when he's talking about this being a harbor and, the greater boundless continent is on the other side, I think he's actually referring to the Americas, the American continent. Now, the thing about that, and I want to get into Edgar Casey later in the episode, because he actually details about how the Atlanteans, how this could just, the term Atlantis could just be a term for that city on that island. And it was actually part of a much larger civilization that existed 10, maybe 15, or maybe even 20,000 years ago that was all across the entire planet. And I do genuinely believe that ancient Egypt is directly tied into these Atlanteans. Now, it's kind of speculation whether the peoples from the Americas are or not, but what do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I've read that part too, and yeah, we'll get into Edgar Casey because a lot of stuff he says is it's more on the out there side, but there are parts that make sense to me. So, reading about the harbor, where this was basically your checkpoint, right? You stop in there, and then you go. Even back then, transcontinental travel on the water was nuts. You know what I mean? You've read stories. I mean, Columbus and that sort of thing. It's very, very dangerous. But the topography that we're looking at here makes a lot of sense that something was right in the middle of the ocean. I mean, it's almost smack dab in the middle of the ocean. And then being west of the Strait of Gibraltar or the Pillars of Hercules, that is right on point with what we're looking at here. I mean, we can't, it's not that much of a stretch of the imagination. And things that I've read was Atlantis wasn't the idea of it was a single island. It wasn't, that's not it anymore. It was a multiple island, chain basically.
Yeah.
So looking at this and seeing, and if you have tectonic plates that converge in three ways, basically, right in that spot. I'm certainly no geologist or seismologist or anything like that. I'm not going to, but it makes sense that if you're converging, one's going to go above the other, or they're going to, go down together like that, right?
Yeah.
Like that. If that's the case, that's a void sucking water down. It's not impossible to think that to use the geothermal energy that is, theorize about that, what they use, earth crystals and things like that to gain energy.
Yeah.
It's not unrealistic to think that they would have to sit along a fault line to gain that seismic energy.
That's a good point.
Heat,
Yeah.
energy, what geothermal, hydroelectric, whatever it might be, to be there and use the unstable nature of our tectonic plates as that. And, they just did not know a massive earthquake was coming, because every text you read about this mentions, falling into the water. It
Yes.
mentions a flooding event, but it also mentions an earthquake.
Yes.
And if you were sitting on top, we all know the San Andreas Fault here in America, and there's so many earthquakes, mini earthquakes that people deal with every day. They, don't even make the news, right?
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about that here, your water underneath is protecting you essentially from those mini quakes. Those are your shocks on your car, right?
Yeah.
So when you have a big one that sucks it down, it's not crazy to think that that's going to that it's so much pressure that it might break your island. Now you have a crease, and now it's starting to sink.
Yeah.
I think for me, if I, gun to my head type of thing, I have to, say, what do you believe in? I do believe that this was the area, whether it's the harbor or all of Atlantis. I do believe that this area is the starting and ending point for researchers. I have no idea, if anybody's actually went out there, went to the bottom, but now, hundreds of thousands of years later, I don't even know if you're going to find anything. Water is more destructive than fire at some points, right? So,
there's a lot of geothermal activity. There's a lot of volcanoes, a lot of island chains to that area. So, we know that geothermal activity can create and destroy islands. And if you're on a fault like that, just like we all know with the San Andreas Fault, it can fluctuate. Things can fluctuate. And you brought up a really great point about how they probably use the geothermal energy coming from that rift to power all of their things. That would totally make sense. Especially what could have happened is they designed whatever their kind of geothermal power plants were, and they disrupted the natural state of the area, because we know tectonic plates basically sit on magma. They're floating on magma. Yes. So if you have some sort of industrial society, just like we've induced climate change, if you have some sort of industrial society screwing around with a fault line, maybe they induced a cataclysmic earthquake.
They didn't know what they were
exactly
inadvertently doing. Do I believe they purposely knew? Absolutely not. Who would want to do that? Just off the top of your head, where should I build a huge ass city in the middle of the water on 3 tectonic plates? It's probably not the first thing that comes to mind. Let's just be honest. So they had. Could this go into a little bit of Plato's hubris, where we are gods? And that was fabled about Atlantis. They were demigods. We're better than the average man. We're better than the people that live around here. We know more. And they did not take into account that the greater force, even greater than them, was planet Earth. Yeah. So, you can combine both theories of this into one and have them both make sense. Yeah. That's what I love about this topic. And there are a few topics like this in the paranormal. And we hope to explore all of them, But this is one where, you could, Plato could be right, and the actual legend of Atlantis be right. And both of them, as you get older, we have the capacity in our brains to realize, hey, multiple things can be true about the same subject. There is no true and false.
I think that goes back to the point where I think Atlantis was just the name of a city that Plato was aware of that was part of a much larger, a much more vast, think about it this way. If he just said New York, that's just New York. That's not referencing all of America. You know what I mean? And to your point about America, I think America is actually a great allegory to Atlantis, because compared to the rest of the world, our own hubris, we kind of live like gods here, and the rest of the world, like you have sections of the world that are living second and third world, countries. Like
No, you're right.
there's a lot of poverty and hunger and destruction in the world, and here we are in our safe little bubble with all of our advanced technology. It could have been a very similar scenario where they had a civilization that went across the planet in certain pockets, just like ours, which were advanced. Atlantis was like their version of New York. It was the biggest city, the most famous, and it just went under. But
Absolutely.
yeah,
Oh, sorry, I didn't know if you were still going.
yeah, go for it.
With us and that sort of thing. We just might be in, we haven't reached our full extent of that civilization. When you look at every major civilization that dominated in certain different eras, there was a point. There was a point of, I need to take over the world. We need to have everybody doing what we do.
Yes.
And that's not different from Atlantis, who actually, fought other, civilizations and only really got humored or humbled once, and that was by Athenians, in Greece. So, if you were to believe Plato, that is. But, us as a civilization being America, I don't, you can make cases for certain things, oil in the Middle East and things like that. We haven't had that march that we need to take over all of the other countries, and I think that's because we aren't superior. And even if we are superior, we're not by that much. You know what I mean? We know that we can't go ahead and take everything over. Can that time come? Absolutely. Look at society, anthropology, and people, the history of people. We always want to go take something over.
Yeah.
Let's just go take it from them. The most common, premise to any war. But with Atlantis, they started to drink their own Kool-Aid, basically. They started to think that they were better than everybody and launched attacks on other areas, which, when you have that, it's not the foreign enemy that you got to worry about. It's your own people that you have to worry about. Are you not pro-Atlantis enough? Are you not pro-resources enough?
Yeah.
Do you care? This isn't what we were founded on. And you have that. I believe it was the... they called it, I believe it was like the Church of the God of One or something that was on.
Oh, yeah. That's Edgar Casey stuff, yeah.
Yeah, that's Edgar Casey stuff. But that right there showed that, hey, this isn't what we were founded on. This isn't what we were built on. And when you get to other civilizations, and I've only lived in the American one. So if you go to the American one, you have people saying, this isn't what the Constitution said. It's almost repeating, you know what I mean? And those same themes are coming through over and over again throughout history.
And not just that, but you're absolutely right, because, we can kind of see that in the fall of the Roman Empire. Like, I think time is essentially cyclical. And we've kind of, and the way that we view time, the way that we're taught in school is pretty much, about history goes back about as far as about 2, maybe 3,000 years. Okay. When in reality, we should be looking at a time scale of more like the past 10 to 13,000 years, because we have, evidence and artifacts of, societies living back then, going back to Göbekli Tepe. But the fact of the matter is, coming from about 12,000 years ago, is this idea of a flood myth. And throughout all these ancient societies, you have these ideas of a flood myth, of some city getting wiped out by floods, by cataclysms, mostly water. And I believe that is from something that was a real event that happened. And personally, I subscribe to the idea of the Younger Dryas impact theory, in which there was a rash of comets that impacted our planet about 12 to 13,000 years ago that melted the continental ice shelf and raised the water level about 20 to 30 feet, something like that. It might even be more than that. But just that amount, 30 feet of water, most of our cities are coastal, okay? If you rose the water level 30 feet, that wipes out almost every major city on the planet. That if it's a permanent 30-foot rise, like that is almost every major city on the planet, including New York. New York is actually having problems with their water level right now because they're built on a swamp, basically. But I think that was a real event. And Atlantis suffered from that, and society went through a cataclysm 12,000 years ago, and they had to reorganize. They had to, and I think. But what do you think about stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I was trying quickly to find. I can't find it, but you're right. Getting back to the sea level rise, you hear 20 or 30 feet, and you're like, okay, what? We think, all right, just a 20 or 30-foot wave and all that.
Yeah.
But no, it would engulf,
if it's
Delaware,
permanent,
Jersey, Philadelphia. You would be underwater.
Yeah.
Which, if like you were mentioning on the most of our major cities, yes, they are. You go all the way up and down the East Coast. You got Boston, you got New York, you got Philadelphia, Baltimore, even DC. And then down south to Miami and things like that, all of those cities would be underwater, and that would account for probably close to 100 million people out of our 350 million in the country. And that's just on one coast. Let's flip it to the other side. L.A., San Fran, Seattle, all up and down that Pacific coastline, and down south to Louisiana, Texas, and things like that, all of those rising, it most likely could be upwards of 225, 300, or 250, even maybe 300 out of the, 350 million that are on the planet.
Yeah, it's catastrophic.
In America. It's catastrophic. So,
yeah,
I love that theory about the comets. There was one of the readings that we were talking about in preparation for this, talked about a comet that hit in Greenland, was it?
Yes, the Hiawatha crater.
The crater. Yeah.
Which I believe is still the most likely scenario. There's been a new study that came out last year that it's just one study by Science Advances Journal, something like that, about how they measured isotopes, and they determined that the crater is actually 60 million years old. But I would like to see more evidence with that, because I think more evidence points to the fact that is the crater. That is the one that some type of comet or asteroid impacted the Greenland ice shelf and melted that ice shelf, thus raising the water levels. Mm-hmm. That is the most plausible in my mind. But again, there's theories that go against it. But, there are also other multiple different theories of the location of the city of Atlantis as well that I would like to get into before. But what do you think about the Greenland crater impact?
The Greenland crater, 60 million. That obviously that would predate this.
But it was a limited study. I don't think that's enough evidence to really come to that determination. That's my opinion about it.
Yeah, no. Obviously the proof is there's a crater, so something had to have fallen, right? Mm-hmm. You have that. So we can get that whether it was real or not. There's the evidence of that.
Yeah.
With raising the the water level in the ice shelf and hitting all of, I would love to see a map that, if that were the case, right? And that's fact. How much is underwater now? Was this trip, if you think about it, just looking at your map here, if that happened, you would have at least another maybe half inch on the side of all of these.
Oh, yeah. And I had a better map, but I can't find it now, where it actually showed that, and it showed like how the Azores Island was like a full size, like not a continent, but it was a massive peninsula that was about like the dimensions were off, but not far. Like he said, about the size of Libya and I forget what but
Yeah.
it was pretty close to the length of it. But I can't find that map now.
Absolutely. But on here, on this map that we have, um, the idea of the harbor starts making more sense, doesn't it? When we
Yeah,
take that into consideration, you're not going that harbor is not in the middle anymore.
right.
You're only going yay far anymore from where the new sea level would be, right?
Yeah,
Out there. And then that's where you can go to Atlantis. They are the gatekeepers of Atlantis and things like that.
yeah,
I think that's absolutely plausible. And the harbor idea, in conjunction with it, definitely makes a ton of sense.
yeah,
So if we were, in human history, if we are all coastal dwellers because we had to be, our ships not only barely made it across the Atlantic, they didn't want to go that far inland anyway,
yeah.
right?
Exactly.
You wanted to be close to your trade centers. If you're closer to your trade centers, there's less room for attack,
Yeah,
of the supply chain that's going through.
yeah,
So if that's how it was setting up America, it's probably the same way that it was here.
yeah,
So when you have that coastal flooding and you have things of that nature, um, the Mediterranean is probably more of a puddle than a lake, right? I mean, or more of a lake than
yes,
a sea, I should say. Then,
yes, yeah,
you have a ton of more areas all around the west coast, or the western coast of Africa, and then even there's probably a ton of islands, mini islands that got swallowed up in England.
and
So,
also Doggerland, which would have connected England to the rest of mainland Europe.
yes,
So, like this whole area, this whole Bay Area between England and Europe and the Norse countries, that would actually all be a landmass.
yes. So when we're
Oh,
taught about the Great Flood, and we're taught about these things from modern day Middle East, which was the Holy Land, which now becomes the center of this entire continent. Those the stories got told by them because they were the only people that survived. They were far enough inland that they didn't have to worry about any of these flooding things.
right.
Not to mention, what they had to worry about was the growing Mediterranean. It
Yeah.
wasn't the sea flood, or it was a sea flood. It wasn't the ocean. So it got pumped right through there. They just, they had more natural barriers against this
Oh, yeah.
than
Yeah.
other people.
It would have been a very safe location for um, even if the Atlanteans were escaping, they would have gone into the Mediterranean and other directions as well. But I do want to get into another theory concerning
Sure.
what if Atlantis was a nation more inland, and I think there is some validity to this. And if you ever saw the movie Aquaman with Jason Momoa, they actually touch on this theory, where the Reichat structure in Mauritania is a candidate for the actual structure of the city of Atlantis. Now, can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So this is what the Reichat structure in Mauritania looks like. Now the mainstream opinion about this structure is that this is some sort of giant collapsed volcanic geodome that formed. The problem is it's about 30 miles wide. So, I mean, and we have nothing like this anywhere else on the planet. So I mean, the geological explanation, it kind of makes sense, sort of, but I don't know about that. But let's look at it on Google Earth. So here it is on Google Earth, and it's just chilling in here. Now, if we zoom out, and it's in the middle of Mauritania. What it looks like, and from the YouTube channel Bright Insight, their postulation is that there was some sort of massive flood that came in from the Atlantic and wiped this region out. As you can see, flow lines coming away throughout the desert. Another interesting factor about Mauritania is that it's said that its mythical king is Atlas.
Yes.
Mauritania's mythical king is Atlas. So, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that from a nation whose mythical king is Atlas, you have this structure which almost perfectly describes the sort of walled concentric rings around this giant city. I mean, there's some really far out theories like, oh, they dropped a nuke on this city and that's why it looks like it. And honestly, this area is fucking glass. Oh, hold on. What's up?
I said we went back in time, dropped.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah.
That's what Hitler's bell was for.
Yeah. What do you think about all this stuff with the Reich?
I love it. I love all of this because I'm glad we got into this because when you theorize about maybe it's a natural structure like a collapsed supernova volcano. Putting my skeptic, I can see looking at it. You know what I mean? Why they might believe that. I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
However, when you talk about the diameter of this would rival this supposed supervolcano under the Yellowstone.
Oh yeah.
Or, and multiple times bigger than Vesuvius that wiped out, in Italy, right?
Yeah.
So, I can, looking at it, okay, I can see where they got that from.
Right.
The concentric circles appear nowhere, and I mean nowhere else in structures around ancient civilizations.
Yeah.
And, when you talk about their ruler of Atlas, which Atlantis obviously would mean the island of Atlas, that makes total sense to me here.
Yeah.
Where I want to see this was all of the renderings and everything that they talked about. We love to put it in a circle, but a lot of the renderings didn't have it as a complete circle. It had it as basically a floating town. You know, there was no farmland. There was no, it was buildings up into the sea.
Yeah.
That's so from that area I can be a little skeptical with this here. And also it talks about, we can make the Pillars of Hercules and we can make the Strait of Gibraltar thing because yes, you would have to go out around that if you were getting to it by sea.
Yeah.
However, one of the biggest things about Atlas that makes me kind of weary about this structure, honestly, is that it was renowned for its naval, fleet.
Yes.
I don't know in Mauritania, that far away from the water.
Yeah.
I don't know how great or how much of a need they would need a naval fleet. They would be more, I would think, on the foot soldiers type of area. And attack around that.
The argument for that, and I totally get that, and you're probably right, but the argument is that around 20,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was green. It was green, maybe like New Mexico is. Like there was definitely shrub, there was farmland, there was all sorts of stuff, and Bright Insight postulates that there was a canal that went from this Reichat structure to the sea. Now, I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but that's their postulation. If that's the case, then that would make sense. I mean, it looks like if a flood were to happen, floods tend to flood out water plains. So there could have been deltas and rivers in this area, but we just don't know. That's the main issue with all of this. When you go back 10, 12, 15, 20,000 years, we just don't know. Even modern science really has a hard time with it.
I love that it does that, to be honest with you. You know what I mean? Because it gives us a form for a podcast too. And then secondly, it brings into the discussion of, personal beliefs in relation to history. The people of Atlantis were supposed to be direct descendants of Poseidon. That was one of the theories about it, that, they were demigods, but their lineage took you to Poseidon. One idea that is theorized and thrown out there, and I'm sure you've come across it, was the water, or the sea nation, basically up against the water of Beliki, and that area was a Greek area that was more advanced, had a superior navy. Their god or their king was a supposed direct descendant of Atlantis,
Yeah.
and through, I believe it was a volcanic earthquake,
Yes.
in one day went into the water.
Yeah.
And so some people can draw the conclusions like, hey, if you believe all this about Atlantis, this place actually went through it. It just has a different name.
Yes. I've heard about that. It's very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is very interesting because a lot of the supposed things that happened to it.
Yeah.
And, being direct descendants of Poseidon, and we all talk about water, this one's kind of like counter to that because it was attached to the mainland, just like this one would have been. You know what I mean? It wasn't the island where it theorized it was an island. It was an island. It was an island. But getting, away from that and into what really happened, obviously we don't know what truly happened. But if you were to believe and try to make a connection between Egyptians and people of Atlantis, there is a common thought, and this would be Casey as well, where, people left because they did not, I don't want to make, no pun intended, but rats deserting a sinking ship, and restarted their population over in Egypt. They sailed inward through the Mediterranean, landed in Egypt, and then thus became, Egypt is the greatest civilization that we can trace back, that we actually know about. You know what I mean? You can go see pyramids. And there's a thought that they are just the descendants of the Atlantis people. What do you think about that?
Now, so this is my real favorite subject, is like, how old is ancient Egypt really? Now, my personal theory is that the ancient Egypt that we see in movies and on TV, that's actually just an end fragment of a much greater civilization that went back much farther into Atlantis. It literally was Atlantis. I think that they were the Atlanteans. And their civilization probably goes back to before the Ice Age, about 20,000 years or much further. Now, if we look at what's interesting is that there is some proof of this. Now, a lot of people think that ancient Egypt, they just got the pyramids and there's a couple ruins and whatever, that's about it. No, there are monuments and ruins all over Egypt, like buried throughout the desert, all over the place. Like these ancient peoples were moving these giant megalithic blocks all over this area. And in their time period, at their height, it would have been a lush savanna. It would have been very capable of supporting this kind of life. And now a lot of Egyptian monuments and sites are actually closed off by the Egyptian government. Like, you can't go there without special permits. So, like, studying ancient Egypt has kind of come to a halt unless it's like allowed by the Egyptian government. And I think it's because they are finding that there's a lot of information that conflicts with modern timelines that we're comfortable with. One of which is the Abydos Kings list, which basically dates back Egyptian pharaohs and kings for about, I think about maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years. And once it gets to the 4,000 or 5,000 year mark, Egyptologists have arbitrarily decided that beyond that point, it's mythology. So this is a portrayal of it. I think it might be a picture of it. And the list just keeps going back. Now, at some point on this list, Egyptologists have decided that beyond it, it's fake. It's just, there's no way that Egyptian society could have gone back that far. And the implication is it goes back 36,000, maybe 40,000 years.
Do you know why they say that? What the reasoning is?
They say that it's mythological reinforcement of the godhood of the pharaohs. That's their claim, is that by listing the kings back going back that far, it reinforces the godhood of modern pharaohs. So it basically
I
was
guess
just all made up.
they couldn't find. There was one point that they're like, all right, okay, I have stuff on Mark, I have stuff on Tom.
Yeah.
I don't have anything on the guy before Tom. I don't have anything on that guy. So that's where you're thinking this. They're thinking the switch, turned on to actually real history from mythology.
Basically, but it's presented all the same as though that was totally real before. And I think there is some truth to that. I think Egyptian society went back much farther than we're comfortable with. And I'd like to get into Edgar Casey now.
Sure.
So I just
Our
want to,
guy.
yeah, I really like Edgar Casey. Now, I am not into like Nostradamus or things like that, like prophets and predictions. Like, I don't really care about that kind of stuff. And Edgar Casey is sort of in that category, but he didn't start out talking about Atlantis. So here's the deal with Edgar Casey. He was a well-known psychic. I think he lived in the late 1800s in Virginia. Or maybe Virginia or Kentucky, I forget which one. But he initially started out as just a regular average guy, and he had a problem with his throat. He was trying different things to cure his throat. He went to a hypnotist, and through hypnosis, he was actually able to cure his throat, but a side effect of hypnosis was him somehow being able to channel some sort of entity, which was later identified, I think, as Ra. So the reason why I think he's valid is because he didn't start talking about Atlantis like this. He started using his hypnosis. He was a very devout Christian. He started using his hypnosis abilities. People would put him into a trance, and he would give people medical advice, and the medical advice worked. He was almost 100% accurate when he was giving medical advice to others, and doctors would come far and wide to try to disprove him, thinking he was a hoax, trying to disprove whatever he was doing while he was in this trance-like state. So his real career doing this was giving medical advice, channeling medical advice from some higher entity that seemingly was always accurate. Then much later on, they started asking this channeled entity about past civilizations, because the entity would talk about past lives and reincarnation and things like that. And this Ra figure, apparently the god Ra from ancient Egypt, who attempted to contact the ancient Egyptians with mixed results in the past, decided to contact Casey and tell him about how the Egyptians were descendants from Atlantis, and the ancient Mayans and Aztecs were also part of the Atlantean civilization, which I just find fascinating. Mm-hmm. But they also delved into things like the continent of Mu or Lemuria, which is really hard to take. So you do have to take this all with a grain of salt, because that continent, it would be really hard to see how that would be real. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, so I have heard of Edgar Casey and his, well, I guess they would be prophecies, if you were.
It's kind of prophecies, yeah, sort of. It's like channeling.
Yeah, like him channeling another trance, which would be a form of, when we had just talked about astral projection and things like that.
Yeah.
They believe it is a trance. They believe it is a consciousness leaving your body, and if it intermingles with a different entity, that's all within the realm of astral projection. So if he was able to do that, I don't know if it was a side effect of hypnosis, or he was able through hypnosis to achieve a meditation state that would allow him to leave his body. So when he talked about, Atlantis and leaving, and, Mu, which would be roughly where America was. So that's really, odd, to say there. But when he talked about, Atlantis and leaving the civilizations, plus the Mayans, the Aztecs, you would be naive to think they only went in one direction, right?
Yeah.
If you were to leave in this, whether it's infighting, war, or the natural a natural disaster effect. Not nobody in any civilization is 100% organized. If you were on the East Coast, you probably went towards Egypt. If you were on the West Coast, you probably went towards America, which eventually, Mexico. And if you went in a straight line, you would have probably hit Mexico, southern Florida, that sort of thing. And then if you were south, you probably kept going, and eventually currents would take you around the tip of South Africa, and you could, that's where you get a lot of the Incas and the Mayans up and down the west coast of South America. So, anybody who could get off, I definitely believe that they did not only go to the Middle East. When you look at Egypt, and then you look at the Mayan pyramids and the Aztec pyramids, and 2, 3, 4 Incas as well. Machu Picchu is a structure that, hopefully we'll talk about that too, because that's the wild one as well. When you talk about all of those on the literally the other side of the earth, you know what I mean? When you talk about it as literally the other side of the earth, their organization of cities, their structures, their way of life, is almost the exact same. It's almost the exact same as where you have
very similar. Yeah.
So where did that come from? It has to come from a similar ideology in the beginning. Then you devolve, or not devolve, but then you have differences in it as you go along through society. But at the same time as when you set everything up, it does look like they had the same ideology as the Egyptians, and they just had different material to do it. So that's why the pyramids look like pyramids, but not exactly like each other. One's in a forest temporal climate, the other one's in the desert. You're not going to have the same structures being built around you. But I absolutely love his story, and he was rather new to me, to be honest with you. He was one of the new stories and avenues, in researching this topic that I went to. And I think it's fascinating that, his trans-lake state, and it's almost going to sound crazy, and I want to hear your opinion on it too, but it's going to sound nuts that I believe him more in a trans-lake state than just a simple human saying this is what, this is what it was.
I think his text when he's supposedly channeling Ra, I think it's very, very fascinating. It's very, very fascinating. I don't know how much truth there is in it, but I don't see how a person like Edgar Cayce could just make all that shit up. There is so much text that he put out. I mean, he's just on the couch in this trance-like state, just talking for hours and hours and hours as the secretary is writing everything down. But the thing that I wanted to bring up is what you brought up before, is that his descriptions of Atlantis are describing a highly advanced state. So he's describing crystal-powered airships that are projecting light beams to transfer energy. Okay, now a person in the late 1800s, I mean, if they saw one of our planes or vehicles, I mean, you might describe them that way, maybe. Yeah. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds like, and more to what you were saying earlier about how the humans from Atlantis were considered demigods. I think that lends into the idea that humans from a previous civilization had some sort of psychic abilities that they were able to hone. Either they had those psychic abilities, or they discovered technology that facilitated that. And I think what they're really describing, what Cayce was really describing, is command over electrogravitics. I think that they discovered some sort of anti-gravitic technology. I think anti-gravitic tech is a lot simpler than we're led to believe, and they figured it out back then. And his descriptions of Atlantis are describing that. And just from the light beam transfer of information alone, I mean, that's a laser. We know lasers can fiber optics that transmits data. I mean, you're talking about a guy from the late 1800s talking about essentially fiber optics through a channeled entity. it's pretty wild stuff, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's a spoiler for our listeners here. We will be getting into a very deep dive, and we'll be amazed to find a very deep dive on reverse engineered alien tech and how it affects our daily lives. Because I truly believe that you, me, and a lot of people out in the United States, all over the world, honestly, are using some forms of reverse engineered
Yes.
tech. And fiber optics is just one that would fit that mold, because if you use the internet somewhere in there, you're using fiber optics.
Yep. That's right.
I'm sure if whoever gave us that tech could see how we were using it, they'd be probably disappointed. But it is tech that's allowing us to do that. It's allowing you and me to talk right here and see each other from many, many miles away. So, more to come on that. I should tell the fan base. Okay, so that's all for this episode of the Label Paranormal. I hope you enjoyed listening to this topic as much as we enjoyed telling it. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the podcast, leave us 5 stars, please. Those ratings really help us. And follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page, Label Paranormal, a YouTube page, just as well, Labeled Paranormal. Or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or simply tell your smart speaker, play Labeled Paranormal Podcast. Share your feedback, suggestions, and your own paranormal experiences with us by emailing labeledparanormal@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you for tuning in, and until next time, keep an open mind and a curious spirit. Goodbye, everybody.
See you guys.